This video is going to be an in-depth critical analysis of Final Fantasy XV. This is something I've been working towards for a rather long time. I had Final Fantasy XV on release, I've been playing through it constantly, and I've wanted to do this video to kind of explore the game as a whole. It's a fantastic achievement as far as games go, in both its scope and its breadth, and I'm hoping to explore Final Fantasy XV now and how the end product itself, both the highs and the lows, ended up for everyone, and I hope you enjoy what is hopefully going to be a constructive breakdown of the vast majority of what's in Final Fantasy XV. Now, I'm going to go with the assumption that anyone watching this video is quite familiar with Final Fantasy XV to a degree. If you're not familiar with the game as a whole, this will contain spoilers as such, not necessarily everything that would allow you to understand what goes through the game if you play it yourself, but I'll be alluding to things if not directly reference them outright, and I recommend you play through the game if you have any inkling to do so before watching a video like mine. Having said that, Final Fantasy XV is an achievement in many things, and ultimately I'm not sure I want to list storytelling as one of them. It does many things right. Storytelling is debatably not one of them. I'm not entirely sure, and I feel like opinions will vary as a whole, but that's one of my more negative areas of the game. But in regards to 15 as a whole, as a franchise, because like 13 before it, Kingdom Hearts 15 is a franchise consisting of various medias in different fronts. What I intend to cover is the game, the core game, the base game, and a few patches leading up to the holiday DLC. All DLC from the holiday DLC onwards I will be doing in a separate video in the future. This includes the Gladio DLC that at the time of recording has come out, but all other DLCs beyond that are currently still being developed, and I will handle them in a separate video down the line. This is the base game, the pre 1.1 patch, although I'll explore that. I'm going to talk about Kingsglaive for a little bit, for the most part it won't be referenced. Brotherhood is the same as well. It's very much supplemental media to the game, and you do need to know these things to understand the greater world as a whole in 15. But for the purposes of this analysis and what the game provides itself, I'm not going to be going into them too much. Just my general thoughts on why it may not have been the best ways to actually explore the story or the greater story of the game outside of your core player character's view. Now, I think most people know that Final Fantasy XV has had a rather protracted development. Final Fantasy XV was originally Final Fantasy Versus 13. Final Fantasy XV was originally part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series along with Final Fantasy 13 and Agito 13. But it'd be through various years of development where the game would undergo several different gameplay styles that were more in line with the Kingdom Hearts series than they were anything else. And through the years, development slowly moved up, looking more and more like it was moving away from what that original pitch was in something of the 13 universe. And eventually at E3 it was revealed that Final Fantasy Versus 13 would become Final Fantasy 15. This was important in several ways. One, most of all to Square Enix, that it originally had Versus 13 as a PS3 exclusive, was now able to go multi-format as a main increment in the series. More on the flip side, that game production had effectively stalled and was restarted with a new focus and a new team, but to that extent as well, a new vision to go along with it. Final Fantasy XV was not a game that was in development for a decade. It was a game that was in development for about 2.5 to 3 years. It was very much a rush job, and the actual finished state of the game shows that. There's so many elements of the game that just don't feel like they're used to their potential, or they're areas of the game that are developed beyond having no seeming purpose, or at least a purpose that was intended that never really got capitalized on for the end product. There was a massive scope, and ultimately a lot has been cut to reach the final product, but as a whole, if not used in the main plot, it's likely to be used in some way for DLCs down the line. But ultimately what we have here is an experience that feels like it's only 2/3 complete, which is a shame, and it really does start to show what it doesn't have to give when it really should in the latter half of the game. However, as a general narrative point, Final Fantasy XV really feels like the antithesis to Final Fantasy XIII, feeling like they took the criticism of how 13 portrayed its story in that you very much jumped into a massive world with several characters that you jumped in between, and having all of your information relayed to you for a data log that you'd have to go in and see for anything you wanted to learn in more detail, a la Mass Effect. Final Fantasy XV takes a very much different approach. You're very much streamlined to Noctis, your main character's view, and you only learn what he learns outside of very specific scenarios in the game. This is great for a narrative viewpoint, but it kind of has that, what I'm going to call the Hunger Games syndrome, or at least the syndrome of any book character where you're stuck in that first person and you only learn what that character does. In a world like Final Fantasy XV, that's very much a hindrance, at least in my opinion it is. Now, Final Fantasy XIII didn't exactly handle the opposite of that well either, and I've had my own problems with that I did outline in the case study, but unfortunately that's been deleted from YouTube, and in time I'll go back to that and go through my thoughts on that a third time now. But 15 presents its lore in a very Dark Souls-esque way, indicative of the development team and the Dark Souls developers that worked on it, and it's very much apparent in how you're supposed to discover facts about the world. And again, similarities to other game series like Mass Effect are also prevalent throughout too. There's lots of ways that information is subtly put over to you as the player that you explore through Noctis, but when you want that big scenario or you want that big cutscene to happen off screen to go and jump to the villains and see what they're thinking, you never really get that, and it is a bit of a detriment to the world building as a whole of the series. Expecting world building to be done outside in separate media, unlike Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XV expects you to have seen other things beforehand. They say it's not necessary, but in order to ultimately understand the entire thing, you do need to know this as a whole. Some of it is supplemental like Brotherhood and just makes things a little bit better to you, but Kingsglaive is something that really should have been handled perhaps in a different direction, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, Final Fantasy XV chooses to eschew the typical Final Fantasy tropes of an opening that's high on action, octane and adrenaline rushes, and give us something a lot more sombre. Though that's not before a big opening hook which shows us a very aged Noctis and his crew fighting some sort of demon in a scenario that looks like they're about to die before we get a big massive flashback and the game starts in earnest with that lovely little tease of what's due to come in this adventure, and setting yourselves up for knowing that you're on a big adventure which is going to see our heroes go into a much older form than they initially are. We're introduced to our main character Noctis and his 3 bodyguards for the journey, that being Gladio, Ignis and Prompto, who are set to accompany him throughout the game, or at least most of the game. Noctis is the Crown Prince of Lucius, someone who's due to do an arranged marriage with Luna Freya, a princess from another kingdom, and this will ensure peace and sanctuary and everything else for 2 warring kingdoms. And that's the backdrop we're given at the start of the game, very much with Noctis shown to be not too thrilled about the relationship with his father, but beyond that, you're thrust out of that quite quickly into the Regalia and out into the open world. Or at least mostly, because the Regalia quickly breaks down and you're treated to something that really sets the tone for the game as a whole.
It's a big old place, filled with wonders.
Tell that to my legs.
You guys even pushing?
Hard as I can.
The Florence and the Machine rendition of Stand By Me opens the game truly when you're forced to just push your car down the broken road, and this introduces you into chapter 0 of the game where you're given more of an introduction to everything that's going to go on without any of the big events and setups that would really hold you back or perhaps push you on. Chapter 0 is an introduction to the game, and through it you're introduced to not just your main 4 characters and to an extent the King of Lucius as well, who you fleetingly see throughout the game, but both Sid and Sydney. Sid, who is the master mechanic, and Sydney, his granddaughter, who is in actuality the master mechanic who will be working on your car throughout the game, and your car's your main mode of transport, which obviously if it doesn't run you're not really going anywhere, and so your first port of call in the introduction of the game, this you actually get that repair by doing some quests while Sydney does all the repair work in a form of payment. But it's not long till the game kicks in as a whole, and once you finally realise your ports where you're supposed to ship out, you quickly find that not all is well back at home. The Kingdom of Lucius has been attacked, it's been overrun, and your father, the king, is dead. Now, I don't want to focus too much on this, but I also think now is the best time to mention it. There's a side story film to Final Fantasy XV called Kingsglaive. It's set essentially between chapters 0 and 1 of the game, and this is the only point in the game, bar a little cutscene later, where you'll be fleetingly showed clips from it to show you what happened, to show you the king of Lucius's death at the hands of the Nephilim Empire. And to be honest, I don't like this. The game itself is set up as only ever seeing what happens through Noctis' viewpoint, and this breaks that immersion by showing you clips from the film that look a lot better than the game and certainly look like a full production, and really only speaks of a trailer to make you go and watch the film. Now, I did have a video on the film originally, and that got deleted when my old channel did, so I will just sum up my feelings of the film quickly. It's an okay film, it's the best Final Fantasy film they've produced. The animation is sketchy at times, and throughout the film, if they're not an original cast member specifically for the film, they prop up briefly to just say, hey look, I'm here, but I'm in the game, so go play that. With the exception of Luna Freya, who's very much a main cast member for the film, and more of a fleeting cast member in the actual game, and our love interest for Noctis. So with Noctis' temper quite high and his blood boiled from knowing that his kingdom has essentially been overrun, you hightail it back from the port to find out the Imperial forces have pretty much blockaded every exit out of the area. You're still very much constrained to a small area of the game anyway. The world map for itself is something that becomes unlocked from chapter to chapter, but you quickly find out there's very little you can do, and so your rebellion and the plot starts as earnest with the beginning of chapter 1, where you start to link up with the military forces and the rebellion, with everything that's left from the fallen kingdom and both the people who survive it. It's a fairly strong opening to the game, and it's something that matches the tone nicely, or at least there's a big switch up from chapter 0 that feels far more sombre and far more downbeat, going from that to the instant news that your kingdom has been invaded and your father's dead. It puts the narrative strongly on Noctis to start off with, naturally being the main character who's mostly affected by this and the character you control throughout the game, and it sets him up to be someone who's angry, but also someone who naturally has trouble dealing with this. There's a lot of unrequited feelings for his father that don't really ever get the resolution they should throughout the game, and it's mostly because obviously he's been killed off now, and you'll only see fleeting glances of him in the latter half of the game, where most of what's happened in the earlier game has probably been forgotten. Now, with the prince and his band of heroes very much on the run, you're given smaller tasks and objectives to do throughout the world, starting with linking up with Kor, who is a legendary warrior known as the Immortal, and very much one of the most higher up and surviving members of the Kingsguard from the earlier game, and briefly seen in the film as well. He's a strong character who is highly underused because he's only actually a part of your cast and your party for chapter 2. He gives you one of the objectives of travelling around the various tombs of Lucius throughout the game and retrieving weapons from past kings in order to make Noctis stronger. Now, throughout the game, there's various weapons throughout the plot you acquire just by playing through the plot, but that's only 7 of the available 13 weapons, and if you want to get the rest, you're going to have to do some exploring off the beaten path, which is where the true beauty of Final Fantasy XV comes in. Yes, it's chapter based, and in that it's very much linear, drive here, do this, drive here, do that, or at least for the first half of the game. But Final Fantasy XV is open world. There are quests absolutely everywhere to do, and that's the important thing. You have a map that you can look at any time, and if it looks like there's a building on that map, providing you're in a later enough chapter of the game to actually drive there and it's not locked off, you can go there and you can explore it. Don't worry, you'll know if you're not supposed to be there yet, because the enemies may just kick your ass, but there are even tombs of Lucius you can get much earlier on in the game. If you're willing to go for it, you can get them. You can see that some of them certainly aren't, like Castlemark Tower, are places you just shouldn't be till very late in the game. But there are other places as well, like the mines, that kind of just trick you by giving you low level enemies in there, only for a level 50 enemy to show up and just really show you that, yeah, you don't want to be here, but thanks for exploring. Along with this as well, we have the side characters who like to give you quests, and they all have various quests that you can keep going back to throughout the game in order to do more things for them. Every character, or at least of the around 10 to 15 main sub-characters who hand out quests, have their own little storyline, or at least narrative, that really pops up through the game as well. And we'll talk about most of these characters later, but for the most part, your earlier chapters in the game involve around just doing small things for the Resistance, going here, doing this. And I also failed to mention earlier as well that one of the other characters you get to meet earlier on in the game in chapter 0 is Arden Zunia, who is the main villain for the game. Not that you'll know that for a long time. For the first half of the game, he fleetingly appears and helps our players out, and he will do in later chapters of the game too. You meet him first of all, and he's kind of cryptic, and the second time you meet him, he even offers to drive you into Imperial territory in order to look at getting the various summons from the game as well, in this case the Titan. But a little backtrailing on that. You see, Luna Freya, hot off her appearance in Final Fantasy XV Kingsglaive, has the Ring of Lucius, which is the ring that Noctis' father had, and She has to keep that safe for Noctis while going around from place to place, awakening the various Eidolons through the game, and Noctis is very much trailing her throughout the game. That's his purpose. He's trying to catch up to her so they can be reunited, not just for the marriage sense, but they do actually have a relationship prior to that. Despite being brought up in two separate kingdoms at war, they both have two dogs that they've used the whole time to run messages between them. Kingsglaive early on reveals that Noctis and Luna both knew each other when they were young and have kept in contact ever since. The love they have for each other is quite true, and while it's an arranged marriage, it's not one that either party is wholly against. And that's very much on the back burner of your objectives, and that Noctis very much does have feelings for Luna Freya. Of course, none of this is ever actually front and centre through the game, and in fact you only get the odd cutscene that will occasionally skip to show you what Luna Freya does, and outside of this, and along with what I mentioned about Kingsglaive earlier, they're the only times when the narrative does actually directly leave Noctis throughout the game. The rest of the time you're very much squarely in the sights of both him and his three companions, or Noctis when he's on his own, and that's how the game chooses to go. Moving along a bit, as the game does open up, as I mentioned earlier, Arden Azunia introduces you to one of the first Eidolons you can summon throughout the game, Titan at the Disc of Corthus. It's the first big true showpiece boss fight you get of the game, and one that can actually be ruined in my opinion by what time of the day you choose to do it. Time is always moving in the world of Eos where 15 takes place, and it's possible to fight any open world enemy in both dark, daytime and nighttime, and a big spectacle boss fight like the Titan is something that really should be done during the day in order to maximise the scope of it, something that I personally didn't do on my first playthrough, and I regret it, but I didn't really know it was coming up either, and that's one of the problems. But the battle with Titan isn't just you trying to subdue the Titan, but it's also the Niflheim Empire coming in and also trying to subdue it. The giant Titan has just appeared and is starting to potentially rampage, and naturally you can see why everyone who can will want to take a stand against it and try and pull it down. But the Empire also wants you to not gain the ability of these Eidolons, so it's very much trying to stop you as well. On the flip side of this, of course, it's Arden Azunia, who is actually revealed to be one of the higher ups of the Niflheim Empire, actively seems to be helping you, and it's something of a conundrum that's not made any worse by the fact that he chooses to not really reveal his intentions either, just again fleetingly help you where it seems to benefit him mostly. Following on from that, Noctis obtains the power of the Titan, but unfortunately he also does find he's lost his car while reunited with his teammates, and if you haven't done it already, that's the perfect time to start introducing chocobos to your way of travelling around the world. While you can drive the car absolutely anywhere, you're very much limited to the roads, whereas the chocobo is very much your all-terrain vehicle. You very much want to make sure that they're rentable and on call at all times of the day, so that you don't get stranded without one and face a long recovery time, or just a long walk to wherever you actually do want to go. But of course, while all the sub-characters you met are off looking around to try and find your missing car, you have the objective of now obtaining Ramuh. Since your battle with the Titan, the area you're stranded in, Duskai, is very much stuck in a severe lightning storm that doesn't seem to want to change, and that's a sign that you need to do the trials of Ramuh in order to obtain him and add him to your list of powers. You're also introduced to Luna Freya's handmaiden as well, Gentiana, who follows you throughout the game, and she pops up as and when is necessary to give you hints and clues and guide you still very much cryptically, but very much on a truer path than anything Arden Azunia is ever going to put you on. Outside of doing all this as well, some of your chapters have had you taking down Niflheim bases too, and in one such chapter as well, you actually find yourself attacked afterwards by Luna Freya's brother, Ravus. Ravus is one of the most underused characters of the game, and one again who I'll get into later, but his appearance here is just to instigate some doubt in Gladio and his abilities of him being able to protect Noctis. It's the first time one of your core team members really gets something that shatters everything about themselves that they knew, and it's something that's always set up to be explored in Gladio's DLC, which won't be covered in this video. But for this reason, during one of the early chapters, he chooses to bow out and go and do his own thing, which is when his DLC takes place. During that time, you once again meet up with Arden Azunia, who has a task for you, taking you into yet another unknown area, where you're paired up with one of his own lieutenants, this being Ariana Highwind, another character who is one of the most entertaining characters, or guest characters you'll see in the game, and someone who makes the fights just a little bit more entertaining, especially if you get knocked out. She's a bit more hard-headed, she's a bit more like Lightning than most other female characters are. In fact, she may actually be the game's replacement for Lightning, but she has a lot more personality to her, and as I said, she's just far more entertaining. She's willing to slap your team members and you if you choose to fall in battle, as opposed to helping you up gently. She's very much all about the hardcore demon hunting, and I wish we actually saw more of her. Now, while I probably should have introduced Gladio's sister Iris earlier on in the review because you meet her earlier on in the game, it's not until later on in the game that she becomes a temporary party member as you travel. You meet her early on when you first visit Lestalem, and she gives you a tour around the city in something that feels very much like a date. But after a bit of a tragedy with one of the other side characters, you re-hook up later as a party and decide to travel to Cape Cayenne, where you intend to ship off to go to Altissa and meet Lunafreya. It's during this journey that you get to see a bit more of her. As I said, she's a temporary party member, and you get the optional chance, if you choose to ride a chocobo with her and go in to do a dungeon, which turns out to be a place where one of the 13 Amiga weapons you have to collect are actually resting. So there's a good bit you can actually do with her, but once you choose to depart with her, it's very much a linear journey until you reach Cape Cayenne anyway. And with a couple of other detours on the way, this pretty much marks your transference into what's about to become a much more linear game. You meet up with the vast majority of the main cast you've met up to that point, or at least the surviving cast, and you take one big picture before heading off across the sea to Altissa. This is where Lunafreya is currently being held, and like you've had with your summons Titan and Mammoth before, she intends to summon Leviathan to your aid for you to fight and to eventually bend to your will as well. Another big Eidolon who will be there to help you throughout your journey and who can be summoned when you're close enough to a body of water to actually have him come out. Once you hit Altissa, you've effectively reached what I like to call the first contraction point of the game, where something of that big open world you've had up to this point has now become reduced. Altissa is a big city, but you are limited to only exploring the city. There's no chocobos here, there's no regalia you can use to travel around. It's very much modern in the style of Venice, so there's gondolas you can take to get you from place to place when you don't want to fast travel. But the idea is you are constricted to this city, there's limited hunts, and really all you can do is push forward. Narratively, that's what you're stuck to. However, you can use the power of your dog Umbra to go back in time anytime you rest and back to that big open world of Eos and do more quests and get more skills, etc. Do whatever you want. Something about that though just kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I play it, and I think it's because of everything you've been doing up into that open world, which kind of felt like more guerrilla warfare against the Niflheim Empire and everything you've gone and done up until this point. Now you're very much being pushed towards the end game, even though it's only technically halfway through the story at this point. Going back in time and just doing something else doesn't quite feel the same, and to me as well, I wasn't quite sure how to take it narratively. Is this actually time travel? Because Noctis never refers to anything that's happened, and as I'll get to in a minute, anything that's happened to your party characters as well isn't reflected by going back in time. So is this nothing but a dream in Noctis' head to a degree as well, of nicer times, a time when everything was better before everything went to hell? And I'll follow up on this later, because I think more and more that given the ending of the game, this seems to be more of what it actually is, more a kind of reward that gameplay wise allows you to make your characters stronger, but it's more just a nice dream of everything that came before that Noctis will have, and I'll give my reasons to back this up as well. But the fight with Leviathan when it comes to him is very much you versus him, and you're split up from the rest of your party characters who are doing their own things. As the main fight with Leviathan is about to start as well, Arden appears and actually stabs Lunafreya, effectively ending any chance of any romantic plot happening throughout the game. With Lunafreya's death, Noctis is hit hard, and it's another thing that he has to deal with personally, another person from his childhood who's been taken away, and someone to up until this point who'd been the entire focus of the game. You're going to rescue Luna, that was the whole point of everything you've done, that's why you're always going behind her. Kind of knocks Noctis into himself for a while. He comes a little bit introverted in his character, and it means he doesn't really appreciate the sacrifices that his other members have had to have made. This is going to be a subject of one of the other DLCs for Ignis, who suffers a major tragedy here as he gets an injury that causes him to lose his eyesight, and it's very much a crux and a breaking point for the dynamic of the gang for a fair while afterward. There's a bit of a time skip as well where he does some basic recovering after, but with Lunafreya gone and it being revealed that the nights are slowly getting longer and longer as demons become more and more prevalent across the world, it's decided that Noctis will have to find the crystal that was stolen from Insomnia and get to that in order to stop all this happening, and eventually stop Arden as well for whatever his actual endgame is for all of this. So from Altissa you head off, and eventually what seems to be the final push towards the final plot of the game, where the pace will race up and everything becomes a little bit more exciting but a hell of a lot more linear. You're pushed on a train and you're going into the heart of the Niflheim Empire, something that is extremely linear for the rest of the game compared to even what Altissa was. It is again another big contraction point, where you've gone from one big open world to an open city, and now you're very much on a train. Yes, you'll have a couple of stops on the way, but what you can do within each stop is very limited. The first stop is something designed in the story as something that feels like it could have been skipped, so it's made all for character development. With the party now getting into the heart of the Nifine Empire, but forced to go on this little quest as well, with Ignis tagging along, who can barely walk at a snail's pace, it's not hard to see why the gang dynamic is just not what it was. Gladio is angry at Noctis, Noctis is angry at himself as much as anything else. He was unable to save Lunafreya, and with this as well, he's also now afraid to put on the ring that Lunafreya held for him, given the power of the loose seal. This is something that we'll get into a bit later as well when you finally use it, but he doesn't have the confidence to give himself the power of kings that was all Lunafreya was really holding on to, which is very much the legacy of his father as well. And with that, of course, the constant reminder that yet another person from his childhood who he feels a strong attachment to is yet again gone. Well, it makes for an incredibly slow slog around in the camping sequence that is unfortunately held back by the fact that Ignis without his eyes is unable to cook, and you're stuck eating either basic food out of a can or cup noodles if you choose to take them with you. It really highlights just how much of the glue Ignis is for the group, as much as the mummy as well to a degree, and he takes care of everyone, and without him really the group is at a bit of a loss when it comes to just basic survival and basic upkeeping of their own health and survival skills. And yet the subset of that as well is that Ignis feels like he can't do much, and ultimately Noctis just isn't paying enough notice because he's stuck with his own problems as well, as Gladio points out. It actually leaves Prompto as the only character who's not had some sort of significant thing happen to him, and don't worry, the game's got you covered as well for that on the next stop. Getting back onto the train, it's hinted that Arden is very much there with you, and in a bit of a surprise twist, once you're back on the way, Arden appears on the train to you and starts talking to you like he's your friend. Noctis obviously gets into a fit of rage for his killing of Lunafreya and attacks him like crazy, but Arden, acting not quite himself, seems to run away and hide and acts like they've been friends this whole time, and it doesn't matter what he did. It's very much confusing portrayal for the character. Noctis eventually passes out and is woken up again by Prompto, who informs them that the train is being attacked by the Nifine Empire and they're going to have to stop and fight. In what makes for a rather exciting sequence, and one that was originally highlighted in most of the trailers, it makes for a rather exciting sequence where both you and Prompto have to fight together to hold off a bunch of oncoming Nifine troops. And if anything, one thing you should do in this section is take note of your party screen as well and see who's not listed as a party member but who's listed as a guest. You see, once you've jumped into the sky to take down all the ships that were bringing in Nifine troops, you see that Prompto is on the train and has Arden at gunpoint, finally able to take him down. So you jump in and try to attack as well, and you attack Arden, who falls off the train and turns into Prompto as he does, finding that the whole thing has been a giant switch up and Arden has been impersonating Prompto or using some sort of spell to make Prompto appear as Arden. It makes for a somewhat confusing revelation that is actually telegraphed rather well. Yes, it's quite obvious on the train that Arden seems to be appearing as Prompto and Noctis is just too blind to realise it, but the actual physical setups they do as part of the gameplay is something that I found actually quite clever and rather enjoyable. And of course this brings us into our next twist when it comes to the next Eidolon we're going to find, as the train freezes over and you get a shivering chill that Arden says could have only been from her. You see, in the past, it's alluded to if you've chosen to be reading various information you find throughout the world, is that there is a big battle between Eidolons in the past and they didn't all get on. In fact, one of them, Ifrit, was actually more of a rebel and a villain, and everyone chose to stand and fight against him, but also in the past this led to the death of Shiva. And as the train approaches what's essentially the site of her death, everything in the train freezes over and Gentiana appears before you, who is actually Shiva reincarnated, or at least the undying spirit of her that keeps going on and on. Shiva is very much alive as Gentiana, and Gentiana is with you now, and quite rightfully so, puts Arden on his place, who has a passion for talking when he really needs to shut up, and so Gentiana freezes him in one of the more fulfilling scenes of the game and gives you her power as you choose to go on. But Arden has one final twist for you as you get closer to the Nifine Empire. Noctis' power to summon weapons is blocked, and you, along with Gladio and Ignis, with Prompto being nowhere in sight and not knowing what's happened to him, are forced to drive off in the Regalia that unfortunately doesn't quite make it through the escape. And the Regalia gone, but having arrived almost at your destination, then you find yourself at a loss one more time as you're separated from both Gladio and Ignis and find yourself entering what everyone knows as the dreaded Chapter 13. And if you think you've had a tonal shift before with all the worlds constructing and how the gameplay progression of everything happens, Chapter 13 is almost a complete antithesis to almost everything that's come beforehand. The onset of Chapter 13 in the game represents a complete tonal shift compared to everything that the players played before up until that point. The gameplay switches out with the introduction of the Ring of Lucille, which Noctis decides to finally put on at the beginning of the chapter, and it's not like he has much of a choice. Your weapons are gone, your party is gone, the regalia is gone, and they're very much left in a very almost Final Fantasy XIII-esque hallway that you have to go through one by one. It's up to 2 to 3 hours depending on how much trouble you have with the area, of something that's more closer to a survival horror than it is any standard Final Fantasy or action game in general. Noctis is very much on his own, and it's very representative of where you are in the game at that point as well, story-wise. Everything's contracted around from being a big open world, like I've said before, to a town, to a linear path, to a singular hallway where you can go next to nowhere other than just keep pushing forward as much as possible. You're being hunted by demon soldiers that you have to hide from, or you can use the Ring of Lucille to kind of actively fight. Now, I know the patch has gone through for 13 and there's actually a few subtle differences that have been made. The big change I'll address in the future installment, but yes, I know the Ring of Lucille was updated to be a little bit more effective, which makes the area a bit easier when it comes to fighting back against those monsters. Beforehand, you were really restricted to either using the death spell, which could take a long time, or you can use the other abilities that the Ring of Lucille has that doesn't actively allow you to do too much aside from just run and fight for a little bit. It's great for groups, and the Ring of Lucille can be incorporated into combat generally fairly well, but for its intended purpose in this chapter, until the first patch really helped it along a bit, it really didn't make the chapter any easier to get through. Of course, while Noctis is slogging through this as well, you are treated to little vignettes from Arden, who's speaking over the loudspeaker to you, trying to get under your skin even more so than he already is, and you're also given reasons to believe by Arden that your other party members have just left you, and Prompto is very much in torture and currently dying, or at least on his way to being dead rather soon. Now, this isn't actually the case, and Gladio and Ignis have been working their way through the same place you have, and you do ultimately meet up with them further on in the chapter once everything's gotten a little better. You also meet with an unfortunately dead Ravus, who's able to pass Noctis' father's sword onto him, and this makes again the level a fairly bit easier to progress through once you've actually got a physical weapon you can use. But this also undercurrents the fact that Ravus as a character has not had enough development. The first time you see him, he acts as a foil to Gladio and your bodyguards as a whole, showing that their power is just lacking, while as in this second encounter, you really feel like you've missed so much, with only an interluding scene between Luna and Ravus that is shown earlier on in the game that shows his motives aren't quite what you'd expect. It's more of a case of he has a lack of faith in Noctis and is only happy to support him as long as he feels like he can actually do his job, which Luna Freya insists he can, but that's still fairly cryptic in the plot at that point, because until the end of chapter 13 you won't really know what's going on with the plot as a whole anyway. However, before we get into that, let's get on to Prompto, who you eventually find locked up further on in the chapter. Unlike most of the character of Niflheim, he's managed to avoid turning into a monster, and while it's never really explained as part of the game or addressed at all in general, I'll get into that with his actual character later, but it's revealed that he can get himself out of this prison-like structure you're in because he is in fact from Niflheim himself, something that the players may know if they'd watched Brotherhood up until this point, but other than that, it makes for a nice surprise. But the fact that the characters choose to embrace him no matter who he is anyway just speaks to the bond the group has as a whole and what they've gone through together, and also alludes to another story that needs to be told as part of the DLC, just like Ignis and Gladio beforehand, and just like we'll be getting later on during the year anyway. Of course, with the party now reunited, they're able to focus again on that actual task, which is to destroy the crystal which is at the top of the building. They work their way towards that, but on the way are stopped by a now demonised Ravus, and this is where the big crutch point of the chapter really comes to an end. While you can do your best and you can take down Ravus, the onslaught of demons coming at you is almost impossible to stop, and therefore as Noctis you're forced to run off while your other party hold the line for you, giving you a chance to get to the crystal, which you do eventually do, and this is where the game kind of switches foot a bit. Noctis isn't able to actually destroy the crystal as much as he's sucked into it, revealing it to have been Arden's plan the entire time. Your other party members finally catch up to Noctis, but they're unable to stop him being sucked into the crystal and hopelessly attack Arden, who's actually revealed to be immortal himself. And this is where we get our giant time skip. If you remember at the start of the game, you see Noctis and his crew at a much aged level, and it was always my thought that you'd actually play through them aging and this skirmish against the Niflheim Empire would take place throughout most of their life, but in actuality, everything has taken just a few months on the road, and now all of a sudden you're stuck in a crystal and you're about to get a massive time skip. During this time in the crystal, they actually use it as a chance to explain everything as part of the plot and what everything has meant up until this point. Inside the crystal, Noctis actually converses with the Eidolon Bahamut and finally tells you that Arden is actually immortal, he's ageless, and this is due to something he did a long time ago in his past. He's actually of Lucis and was once a hero who chose to absorb all the demons into him, which effectively gave him eternal life because none of the spirits would actually allow him to pass on from that point on after he'd done it. He's also denied being able to rule as well for what he did in the real life, and he's plotted his revenge over thousands of years. it's spiked to the highest level, but in order to finally take down the chosen king who Noctis is revealed to be, he needed Noctis to be his most powerful, which is why in the past he helped you and why he killed Luna Freya to spur you on. Everything has been guiding him to make Noctis as powerful as possible for that big confrontation, which when you go out the crystal again you'll have the chance to do. And as Noctis finally emerged from the crystal, two things are revealed. The Eternal Night has come, and it's been 10 years and the world has pretty much gone to hell. Of course, the game has one final surprise to pull at you before you're thrown back out into this 10-year world. Noctis has to die. He has to sacrifice himself for the good of the world, and only that will bring the daytime back and the Eternal Night end. And of course, Arden now also has got what he wanted as well. Noctis is older, he is the chosen one, and he is at his full strength. Arden very much has been playing the long game this whole time over these generations, wanting Noctis to be at his full power, keeping him alive and aiding him in the best way possible so that he's ready to kill him in the most opportune moment. And that time has finally come. So with your release from the crystal, you make your way back to Eos via boat, and you get picked up by Talbot, a young boy you met originally during the game, but has now grown older in his 10 years and is very much part of the demon hunters who now help guard the world from the overrun demons that are very much everywhere. And they are everywhere. You will need to be on your guard from the minute you step foot in this new ever nightly Eos, because there's demons everywhere, both high level and low level, and your little trek can become quite intimidating if you're not quite ready for the amount that's going to be thrown at you at the gate. Of course, you eventually make your way back to Hammerhead Station, that's now become a fortified demon hunting base, and you're reunited with Gladio, Prompto and Ignis, and you get to finally chat about where they've been this whole time, and you get one final night, one final little surprise around the campfire. Ignis has adjusted to his time over the years, and perhaps as someone who's blind in the world of Eternal Night is best equipped to deal with the demons more than anyone else. Of course, you have to discuss that one thing. One, that you don't intend to return from this journey. Two, it's very much a suicide mission. And three, this is very much the end for all of you, no matter what form it takes. You're going to hit Arden head on, you're going to hit him hard and fast, and you're storming back into Insomnia. You're going home, and you do. You barge in through the front door and you fight your way tooth and nail to eventually where Arden is, to one final surprise. Well, one boss. Ifrit, the one Eidolon that never quite got along with the others, is there and stands in your way. And at this point the game has very much come full circle. Like where you saw at the start of the game facing a big fire-clad demon, well, that's Ifrit, and now you have to take him down in something that seemed very much overbearing, but you've got the power of Bahamut behind you, who you can summon as part of this battle, this one and only time to take down Ifrit. Of course, the final blow doesn't necessarily just come from Noctis or Bahamut, but Shiva, who chooses to step in. There's much more of a greater story between these two characters, both Ifrit and Shiva, but you're going to have to really go into the extended lore and media to really get a breadth of it, and it's revealed in a very cryptic way in both the media you can pick up and listen to throughout the game, as well as a big post-game dungeon that I'm going to get into later on as well. But Ifrit goes down and you can take care of Arden, but before you make that big step, Noctis asks to do it alone and take one photograph with him. The choice is down to you, and you can either make it for a somber moment or you can take a picture of Iris or whatever you want. It's just a nice touching moment between the characters, and I chose to make it that, taking a photo of just more or less everyone I'd met on the journey, as well as from the first time you left for Altissa. So entering for one final fight, one-on-one, Arden versus Noctis, a fight that thematically has all the stakes up there, but it's very much an easy fight for the most part, versed in how the combat works at this point, and for once Arden, a character that can teleport just like you, makes for an interesting fight, but Arden makes for a surprisingly easy opponent in the long run, and not quite of the grand scale of the general enemies you've had before, but I think that's part of the downplaying tone. This is very much a personal battle for both characters, and while the world is on the line, it's always been more personal than this for both of them. Arden wants his revenge as the fallen hero as he is, and Noctis wants to fight for his kingdom and is struggling through in order to sacrifice himself to put everything right. Of course, it's made worse by the fact that more or less he's been groomed his whole life, not just by Arden, but everyone, in order to eventually die for this. His father knew it was going to happen, and almost everyone who's aided him at some point has known it's going to happen, with the exception of his 3 party members who he informed later. It's not so much a revelation to everyone else, and while it feels like the power of everyone is behind Noctis, the ultimate tragedy of the situation is very much apparent as well. And this is when Final Fantasy XV ultimately reveals itself, that it's not a love story, it's not a tragic love story, it's not a big epic adventure at the most part. It's a tragedy in almost all its forms, almost Shakespearean in that way. And with that, Arden is finally dead, and Noctis is able to sit back on the throne and finally claim back the day. And with that, obviously sacrificing his life in a lovely vignette where you see all the past kings coming out and slowly stabbing him one by one, with his father appearing to do the final blow. Something that's quite poignant, but also very sad given the journey that ultimately almost everyone who's close to Noctis now has died, and with the fates of your 3 travelling companions ultimately left unsaid as well, it's highly likely they died in defending you and buying you that chance you got to have a one-on-one confrontation with Arden. Ultimately, Noctis' final breaths are seeing a vision of Lunafreya, or perhaps a spirit of Lunafreya, coming to him and laying next to him on his throne, as the title screen nicely goes back into that final opening logo for Final Fantasy XV that now features an additional Noctis added to it as well, and something that is the ultimate game loop and the ultimate troll to a way to your story. But also summing that up, it's a real tearjerker actually, especially given how you've had, well, possibly more than 60 hours, if not more, 90 in my case, acclimatising to these characters, learning about them, spending time with them. Everything about the first half of the game is made to make you love them, so that the second half of the game can strip away everything that makes them great almost to a degree, puts them at ends with each other, puts them at ends with the plot, and makes them work towards a conclusion that can only end in tragedy and death. And in most cases, for most people, that's exactly what's happened. As I said, it's suitably a tragic ending, and an ending that I actually feel is quite brave for what they've attempted. It's not like Noctis has sacrificed himself for the good of everyone. Everyone he really loved has already been taken from him, and to a degree he doesn't really have much left to fight for anyway. He's done everything he was ever groomed to do, and he was groomed, and that's the big problem. Everyone has known really what they're pushing him towards, and the struggling realisation of what he'd have to do as well when stuck inside that crystal only made it worse. He had 10 years in that crystal to acclimatise to the fact that he was going to have to sacrifice himself, and therefore coming out of it he's already very much set on what he has to do. During the credits you can get a nice little segment that shows what happened when they talked to each other that night when they went camping before the final attack on Arden in Insomnia. It's depressing, but it's nice to see them finally open up and talk properly about what their actual life has been like, or their actual adventures have been like together, and how everything's changed and how they're eventually gonna fix it all. But with that, the journey is now complete, and of course you can continue on by going back in time and heading into the brand new chapter 15, which effectively gives you lots more things to do on that original big open world map. And now I'll get back into what I meant earlier when I said about having problems with the whole travelling back in time. It's not quite travelling back in time, it's travelling back in Noctis' head, and I kind of equate this to like Final Fantasy X with the Dreams of the Faith and Zanarkand. I feel like the past Lucius that you're travelling back to, that world of Eos that is now bigger and badder and has all sorts of enemies that you could never really take down before, and new characters and new quests that have suddenly appeared, is to an extent a dream in Noctis' head. And I feel like canon wise it works better if you do all of this once you've actually finished the main plot. It makes it look like it's a dream within a dream. Noctis has that post-spirit dream where he's reunited with Luna and his father and gets to go on and traverse past the realm of physical life now that he sacrificed himself, but he also gets his reward in the dream where he gets to travel back and just be with his friends and explore and do everything that I imagine he always wanted to be able to do and always loved doing before that eventual trip to Altis to set all the rest of the adventure of the game in motion. Noctis' reward is that he gets to relive his days as well as have his future in the spirit world with Luna and everyone else, and obviously eventually be joined by everyone else from his companions as they grow old in age too. It's a theory, and it's my theory, and I think in the narrative tone of the game that works for me personally. Something, or at least thinking that Noctis gets an ultimate reward, and the spirits of those other characters can join him in time whether they survived or not. That might be a bit too much of fan fiction for some of you, and for others it might be something that actually works narratively for you. That's up to you, and it's up to you to make your own interpretation when games do endings like this. So let's move on and really just talk about the characters themselves, because they're very much the people who make up this game. This is a game about interaction to a degree, and well, most of the focus is put on the core interactions that we have between our main 4 of the boy band, that being Noctis, Gladio, Ignis and Prompto, as well as the other characters that come and go throughout the game, but the core crux of the game is these 4 characters and how they evolve and interact with each other throughout the course of the game and its events. So let's really talk about them and what makes them one of the most lovable cast of characters I've seen in a long time. Now, while I'm going to talk about Noctis first, obviously he is the main character, many of these backstory details obviously apply to Gladio, Prompto and Ignis as well, specifically stuff that requires you to watch Brotherhood to get a full sense of their backstory, as well as other little side stories too. You have the pre-order bonus that was Final Fantasy XV A Knight's Tale that, from a somewhat skewed perspective, showed the backstory of Noctis' father, King Lucius, and as well as some of the other characters you met around the game who are essentially his retainers, like your 4 companions. And you also have the Platinum demo, which shows a small vignette of gameplay and Noctis' inner thoughts when he was in a coma when he was young, which is an event shown in Kingsglaive. So there's a lot of expanded story you have to really get into, but Noctis as a boy has always had trouble when it's come to his transition as a man and what his actual fate was going to be. Now, his perceived fate was becoming the king of Lucius, and it's the whole protocol and sense of everything which has given him an uneven relationship with his father, something that carries all the way through into the game. To an extent, it's made him the kind of person that doesn't want to be making those big choices that affect everyone, and it's very much made him unprincely and very much unregal in who he is as a person, and most of the time it's what leads him to butt heads with Gladio too throughout the game. Noctis has the biggest trouble narratively through the biggest trials of the game. The first, of course, is when it comes to the title, when he's actually on his own with Gladio, and Gladio is the one who has to really tell him to buck up his ideas and get him in shape, and to a degree as well, that's what happens later on in the game too. Following the events of Altissa and Luna Freya's death, Noctis really feels like he's lost everything that mattered most to him, so much so that he doesn't see the suffering that's still happening right in front of him with Ignis' sight being gone. It's something that causes tensions because even he doesn't entirely know what to do and he's kind of sunk within himself. The tragedy that really is Noctis' life just seems to go from bad to worse with every main step of the game. And unfortunately, with a character like Noctis, there's only so many times when someone can essentially shout you back into your place and get you thinking straight as you should be, and it's not until actual events force him to truly become the man that he needs to be that he ultimately manages to shape up and become that king. And most of that comes with accepting who he is. When he's on his own, he's finally forced to put on the ring, and it's not quite the grand experience that it is in Kingsglaive when Ulrich puts on the ring and is treated to a conversation between the kings, which is something I feel that the game really lacked. Having Noctis giving him a chance to properly talk with his father probably would have actually spoiled what was going to happen in the game before he gets sucked into the crystal anyway, but it would have been a nice moment to have him converse with the other kings and see what they think of him now, and perhaps do that again, putting on the ring a second time 10 years later once coming out of that crystal too. The 10 years later Noctis is someone who's almost completely removed from what he was before. He's someone with the benefit of experience and 10 years of meditation towards a singular goal, and that is sacrificing himself for the common good. As much as it is becoming a revenge plot throughout the game, something that is mostly anger becomes far more personal than it. Ultimately, the plot of Final Fantasy XV for Noctis is something that starts off personal with the attack of his country and the death of his father, but it's personal against an entire country, whereas it becomes singularly a focus against Arden almost specifically throughout the end of the game. Arden himself, systematically, in trying to make Noctis powerful, sets up him to take down more or less everyone else who could have been his enemy in that process, as well as obviously killing anyone else who could have got in Noctis' way too. And Noctis' development is very much singularly focused on that as well. The romantic plot of the game is very much a non-starter, hinting that that's going to be the case once you finally meet up with Luna Freya and always feeling that you're only ever steps behind her, but it gets to that point where you feel like, yeah, something's just not right and you're never going to catch up with her, and ultimately her death, while unexpected at the time given that the ambivalence of Arden as a character is unknown, very much means that there's only one way the game can go at this point, and that's getting worse and worse. And every time something happens to Noctis that you think is going to make his character just get a little bit of hope, that's very much taken away. It's an ambivalent ending, an ultimate tragedy, and it's what makes it such a tearjerker for the character, especially if you've become accustomed to him. I very much doubt Noctis is going to be anyone's favourite character from the game, but he's going to be one of those all-time tragic characters who's set up to fail, but set up to fail at the high cost in what he has to do as a part of his life. But ultimately he has to fail to succeed, and it's ultimately, as I said, just tragic. Of course, rounding up our trio that accompany Noctis throughout the game, of course, Gladio, Ignis and Prompto. Gladio is perhaps the simplest of the characters. He's very much a Kingsguard and has been. It's in the family and it's who he is. He's beefed himself up, he's trained, he's there to guard Noctis, he's his sworn shield, and the only character development he really gets through the game, outside of seeing some of his family issues with Iris, his sister, is that when Ravus comes onto the scene, he beats into him how he's just not capable enough. This leads him to go on and make himself stronger through his DLC, but as that's not covered in the main game, you never really see much of his development, and as such, all his development isn't so much his development, it's aiding Noctis in Noctis's development. He's a character that isn't stoic and is very much passionate about what he does, and he's not afraid to show that. He's loud and can be obnoxious when the time calls for it, but he's always in your corner. He's that dependable shield, and it's very much who he is. He's the strong greatsword wielder who has a shield as well, and that really promotes who his character is. And his character, as all characters in Final Fantasy XV, do tend to be archetypes to a degree. Gladio is perhaps the most obvious of them. Prompto, on the other hand, is very much the scrawny gun wielder of the group, and he's someone who just doesn't have the confidence or the physical ability of the other characters. Now, he's no slouch, and that's due to his younger years when he was actually quite fat, working to better himself, and he has done, but he also has secrets as well. While it's revealed in Brotherhood, it's not actually revealed in the game until later on that he's actually from Niflheim himself, and has such certain coding that allows him to get through some of the security systems and such, but also, due to some special circumstances with his parents, seems to be immune to actually turning into a demon, which is something that happens to many of the people of Niflheim. It's why Arden also has a fascination with him as well, and chooses him, I believe, to be his target of the switcheroo in which Noctis falls for hook, line and sinker through the second half of the game. Prompto is someone who is very much insecure of himself, but just wants to be there for his friend. He somehow himself can't believe that Noctis and the other two are his friends, and he doesn't always seem to understand his place, and that he is an equal within the group, but he doesn't always see himself as that way. It's one of those few times you can really feel bad for his character. He's got so much personality, but under all those layers, he's very much still the scared little boy, but not in the way Noctis is of his destiny, but in just who he is and who his friends are. And I think it makes for a really great and relatable character to a degree. If you've ever been in a situation when you feel like everyone around you is just so much better than you and you don't deserve to be there, there are going to be people who relate to that. That makes Prompto almost the heart of the group without himself even knowing it. That's why everyone's able to rally back together in the hopes of finding and rescuing Prompto. He's the glue, very much like Newt in the Maze Runner series, and everyone rallies around him. He brings them all together ultimately, and he's always there for everyone. While you only see some of his more great scenes in special extras with Noctis, you can see throughout the game if you slept in the right place. The development that Prompto gets is great because it's subtle, and it shows him slowly just becoming more acclimatized to being one of the group and being an equal balanced member of the group, someone who can complement them as a gunner, as a guy who can target, and all these other skills, as well as his great love of photography as well. There's another little thing that really brings the gang together when it comes to grouping up for these great photos and just making sure that when times are at their hardest, you can still have a laugh. Which ultimately brings me on to Ignis, and perhaps next to Noctis, he has the most tragic story of the game, but not so much in what his destiny is, but in his physical ability. Ignis is the mother of the group, and I can see why he's liked so much. He's the one who takes care of everyone else. He's there for them in nutritional ways, in tactitional ways. He does everything. He makes sure the camp's ready, he makes sure the food is ready and nutritious and everything you need. He takes down recipes, he does everything that needs to be done in order to make sure the group survive the wilderness. He does the driving, he does the planning. So when he loses his eyes, something that's not actually shown in the game again and has been reserved for DLC, which makes me think that Arden's going to be responsible so that Noctis loses something even more, it's very much all the tragedy for him personally, because everything that made him great with the loss of his eyesight is taken away. He can't fight anymore, he can't prepare food anymore, he can't take notes anymore. It feels like with that, all Ignis ever was is taken away in one fell swoop, and it takes him 10 years to acclimatise to that and really get back to that point of where he was. Ultimately, the world moves in the direction that Ignis is far more able to acclimatise to quicker. Without eyesight, a world of eternal darkness is hardly something that's really going to phase you, and with him being just an demon hunter as everyone else by the end of the game 10 years on, he just could be even better at it just by sheer example of that he's not relying on his eyes and he puts his other senses first and foremost in order to fight. And like Gladio, Ignis is very much the spear and dagger wielder. He's ready to get in close, but using a lance as well, something that I think is another way that represents his character. A lance helps you hang back, it lets you get your distance to the enemies and take those tactical steps when you need to. You can get up close and personal with knives when you need to as well. That's probably something that's indicative of him. You plan your attack, you wait for that great strike, you create your opening and you charge, and that's something that he champions throughout his various situational parts in the game where he comes up with the strategies for breaking into bases or taking down enemies. And while that's our main characters, ultimately of course there are sub-characters in the game and villains, and it's worth noting over the sub-characters, especially the 3 you actually get in your party as a part of the game. Core, obviously known as the Immortal, the guy who trained Gladio, as well as being one of the most senior members of the Kingsguild as a whole. He's there at the start of the game to put you on your journey, and he's there for Gladio in his DLC too. But the character makes such a fleeting appearance, it's almost not worth him being there for the most part. You don't see enough of him, and I would have liked him to have come back and forth throughout the games in order to do more. There seems like so much effort went into incorporating these characters into the party with their animations and movesets that the fact that they only make fleeting appearances is quite tragic, and except for what you see in Gladio's DLC, you don't learn too much more about him. He's just that stoic hero that everyone knows about and is highly regarded, but his ultimate fate and story and what led him to be who he is isn't really explained in the game. He's just someone to be there and be in awe of. Iris, on the other hand, being Gladio's sister, and strange how many of these side characters are related to Gladio in some way or form, is a lot more interesting as a character. If anything, she actually seems to have great feelings for Noctis, and I feel like without Luna Freya, these two would actually have a chance at a romantic relationship, which makes the tragic events of the game just that much more tragic, if not just for her, because she has something of an unrequited love for Noctis, but ultimately she's never really able to be there in the way that her brother is for Noctis. And while she becomes a proficient demon hunter, so we know, because we're never really shown throughout the second half of the game, and that fast forward later on, Iris is an extremely capable person that ultimately just gets left behind on the journey. You see her for a little while, and the time you're with her, she shows herself to be a very capable fighter in the vein of Tifa with the martial arts, various other skills she uses. It's a shame that she again doesn't get the development, and while she goes on to be a stronger character in the series, it's not a part of the actual game, and therefore, again, her lacking development means that unless we see her in some way or form in another DLC later on, Iris is just going to go as one of those characters who doesn't get the development. She does appear in Brotherhood because she's a part of the cast early on in that story, being Gladio's sister, but she doesn't get the attention that everyone else gets, and obviously because she's not a main character, that's to be expected. But I didn't expect her to get as shoved to the side as she was in the game either. Which brings us to our third and final guest character of the game, Ariana Highwind, who has, in the grand scheme of things, absolutely nothing to do with the plot, but she's just an entertaining character, almost a gun for hire in a degree. She's a demon hunter and employee of Niflheim early on, and you actually fight her as a boss before you do anything else with her. She's an interesting personality, but Arden pairs you with her later on when Gladio's out of your party in order to do some exploring in some ruins, and she shows herself to be a very capable and extremely entertaining individual. She also inspires loyalty in the men that follow her, that being Biggs and Wedge, who are rather minor characters in this game compared to what they're apparently going to be in development. But Ariana seems very much like Lightning to a degree in design, personality and such, but she has a lot more emotion and she's just a lot more entertaining in general. I liken her to Lightning because it feels like she has a lot thematically and aesthetically like Lightning as she is in her Lightning Returns form, and whether that was intended or not I don't know, but it's just who I equate her to, a just much more entertaining version of Lightning who I would actually love to see more of. Once you're done with her in the main plot, you can find her travelling across the map anytime demons show up, and she can join and jump into your party and help you, and you can even do a little game glitch to get her into your party for the rest of the game as well. But ultimately Ariana is just a side character who is a side character for the sake of it, and that's actually a welcome change. When they tried to tie everyone into a plot, Ariana is just there and she's just fun and interesting and a character that I wish we saw more of. But not being tied into a plot means she's only there fleetingly throughout the game to help you when you need her, or when you need to do something outside of the beaten track of the main characters you know. So, given the tragic-like nature of the game, you'd probably think that the villains would actually be more first and foremost throughout the game as well. After all, who's instigating all this tragedy in our main characters, and yet 15 kind of takes a back step with its villains and presents them, or him, in a very singular way at times. It also flip-flops a lot of the villain-like roles in the game and actually has them change themselves to become something more of either anti-heroes, good guys, or at least people who will fight for the cause alongside Noctis. With the open world approach of 15 and the fact that it is more you on the run and taking down the Empire, as opposed to a singular villain for the first half of the game, it's more pushing you along the side of a singular focal point for your villains, in that case the Nephilim Empire. That's both a great way to do it and also a problem, in that there is no singular focus for a villain, no one you're trying to get singular revenge against at the start of the game. Yes, you could argue the Emperor of Nephilim, however you never have any direct contact with him throughout the game, and his death actually comes at the hands of Arden, who we'll get to in a minute. Many characters who are presented along the way as bosses and people who could be villains don't actually end up being. Ramvus is portrayed as a villain early on, but is actually there more for your development and becomes more of an anti-hero to a degree going on, or at least someone who's there to aid you from the background. But because you get so little development on him, even then he can't really count as that. Ariana's presented as a villain early on, you fight her to start off with, but she ultimately becomes someone who helps you and then someone who's there to aid you in the field in the later half of the game. So even then, she doesn't count as a villain for very long, and even the first time you meet her, she's hardly developed and presented as such. So really that just leaves Arden, that singular villain who for the first half of the game is more duplicitous than he is a villain. You know he's helping you for his own means, but you never really know why. And it's not until he kills Lunafreya that his focus as a villain is really revealed, and that becomes your singular purpose for tracking him down and wanting revenge on him. And really from that point on it becomes all about Arden, as it should. As the game becomes more linear in narrative and you're pushed down one path, you're pushed down one path to a singular point, and that is him. Arden is an interesting character. He's perhaps one of my favourite villains I've ever seen in the Final Fantasy game. He's cool, calm and collected. He has a kind of high class snuffery to him that comes with his class, and yet it's not so much because of his class but more because he has a dissonance with everything around him. Nothing really affects him anymore. He kind of gives that impression of seeing everything around him as beneath him to a degree, and that's mostly because he's seen it all and done it all. He's immortal. His backstory is that he once saved the world by taking all the demons and all the darkness into himself, and his reward for this was eternal life, as much as a reward as you can call that. Of course, even in the world of the living he found himself shunned for what he did. Everyone was scared of him because of his power, and after generations of people shunning him, he eventually was forgotten. But his hatred never went away. His hatred allowed him to come back, to climb back up the ranks of the Empire, and from that new position of power, he was able to bend the will of the Emperor to do what he wants, to instigate almost everything that's happened in the game. He's worked everything, he's pulled the strings from the background, all to set up his singular revenge, that he was once due to be a king of Lucius, and he should have been, and now he sees Noctis as the chosen one who he has to take down to get his ultimate revenge. Everything he sets up is to make Noctis more powerful so he can destroy him at the opportune moment. The moment when he's most powerful, he wants to destroy his enemy, he wants to destroy the one he hates the most, but he wants it to be the most fulfilling way possible, and only by making Noctis as powerful as possible does he feel he can get his ultimate reward when he takes his revenge. It's quite thrilling in a way, and it's a shame that we just don't get more story outside of what Noctis sees throughout the game. Throughout the game there's all sorts of lore you can uncover through books and other things that you see throughout the game that give you hints of a great tragedy that happened with a great hero in the past, and yet it's a while before you're able to put the strings together and work out that this is all Arden it's talking about, and he's actually just carried on living all the way in today, and he's now responsible for everything that's happening in the world. He's not out there, he's not a great clown like Kefka, and he's not a complete nutter like Sephiroth was. Arden is calculating in his revenge, and it's very much personal for him, and I'm not sure that on the grand scale of things, yes, the end of the world and the apocalypse is very much happening, but for him and Noctis, it's coming down to a battle between two people who both really want each other dead. More personal than I think any Final Fantasy game has been. Even Cloud versus Sephiroth was only really personal on Cloud's side, as Sephiroth's goals were never really personal to a degree against any one singular person. While I don't think we ultimately get enough time with Arden, what you do see of him is great, and really enough to just make you both love and hate him at the same time, which is quite an impression for any villain to have, and so it makes Arden one of the great standout characters of the game, and the great standout performance as well from his voice actor. So let's talk about the game as a whole and not just the characters and the story, which I feel like we've spent far too long on at this point. As I mentioned earlier, the development of Final Fantasy XV began as Final Fantasy XIII, and unlike many games, it had a long protracted development that went through the entirety of the Final Fantasy XIII saga. It spent years, well over 5 years, being developed into one game that had a completely different focus, and when it became Final Fantasy XV, essentially everything got restarted production wise, and while as much was harvested from the original plot as possible, links to Final Fantasy XIII were generally changed. and I can imagine that the original version of the game had Eidolons replaced with fal'Cie and stuff to that kind of degree, which I'm glad has all dropped, and it makes Final Fantasy XV very much its own universe. But how the development works in general for this game as well is something of a revelation, and something that I can't think many big AAA companies have done over the years. They've actually released several demos throughout the game's production that have allowed people to give feedback and guide the game in the way they wanted it to work. I think this is because they didn't know the best way to make the game play, and so getting as much player feedback as possible early on felt like the best way to go. This came in two forms. The first was episode Disguise that was released with Final Fantasy Type 0, and it introduced everyone to the world of Disguise, naturally, as you explore and do the behemoth killing and a few other little quests, and just introduce you to the game. The combat there is very much different than what we see now. It also got an update later on which showed the first lot of revisions and more combat and extra quests to go along with that too. And closer on to the release we also got the Platinum demo as well, which was something of a side story of Noctis when he was in a coma during the time of Kingsglaive early on when he was young. It's a little bit of a surreal experience and something that didn't really represent the game as a whole. It was a nice little teaser for the game if anything, and of course gameplay changed from the Platinum demo as well to what we got in the final product. Of course ultimately, and this is something I really needed to get around and address, but I've somehow not managed to up to this point, yes, the game is unfinished, and I think everyone knows this. The second half of the game probably was planned to be much bigger, just given the amount of extra places you can go out of bounds and visit in the game. The world of Niflheim was expected to be much bigger, and I think you were supposed to drive around there as well in the Regalia, given the amount of level topology that has been found by people going out of bounds. Ultimately, it was a game that originally had around 7 to 8 years of development, and then that was capsized into 3 years of development when the game was rebooted. It's not possible to keep absolutely everything, and it's possible that some of what we see was actually just from the original version of the game. Ultimately, we'll never know, because I always get the feeling that the world and everything was supposed to contract around you as you went through those final chapters to the end of the game, and yet I feel like maybe it wasn't supposed to be as much of a contraction. Maybe you didn't spend as long on the train, maybe you had more to do at each stop that meant that each city was more like Altissa. It wasn't just going from the big open world of Eos to Altissa to the train, but more going from Altissa to another city in Niflheim, and then to Shiva, and then that final prison where everything starts to end and go wrong. I also wonder if there was more planned for the 10-year time jump as well, to allow you to explore that world a bit more, to see what everything went down and where all a load of endgame extra special bosses could have been placed, or extra hunts, just really high level powerful stuff that you'd have to take down. I don't know how they'll expand on this outside of the DLC, which is obviously made to capitalise on some of these unfinished areas that could be used and repurposed for DLC, and I very much expect the Niflheim stuff to be used for Prompto. It is slightly disappointing, but given the amount of money that's been put into this game already, it's something I actually give Square Enix a pass on. They wanted the game out the door, they wanted 15 to be as best as it could be, but they also need people to understand, they need players to understand the investment that's gone into this game already. Ultimately, it will make me want some sort of follow-up of all this, and you never know, we may get something in the realm of Final Fantasy X-2 or Final Fantasy XIII-2 with 15. A new game in the same world with new characters, and following on from Noctis, or some sort of side story that would be an interesting way to reuse all those characters we've already seen that never got enough development the first time. Play as someone else who's going around the world the same time as Noctis from a different viewpoint. Do something like that expands and reuses all that, because I hate to think that that investment was put into Final Fantasy XV to only be used with just Final Fantasy XV. I don't feel like any company can support that kind of investment anymore, and I've got no problem with a sequel to use all this stuff and to make 15 as best it could be as a franchise, seeing that's clearly what they've gone for. Despite what you think of how much they actually did with the development, what we actually got in the final game, world, environment, effects, action, just about everything is part of the game, for the scope of what they've done and in the time it was made is nothing short of quite an achievement. And obviously a high amount of budget still went into this. It's a main Final Fantasy title, an incremental piece, and therefore the budget for it is always going to be high. But the amount of money as well as effort that's gone into this for the amount of time it actually had been developed since its rescope as Final Fantasy XV is pretty amazing. The world of Eos is exceptional. It's made as a fantasy based on reality. That's the tagline of the whole game, and it makes for an incredible world just to experience. Everything seems to come alive. There's personality in almost every part of it, from the great cities of Altissa and Insomnia to the simple grass and rock formations that make up the world as a whole. It feels like there's so many hidden pieces and so many things to find in the game. They really want to make sure that the player who wants to get into everything never feels like they're going to the same place twice, and for the most part in the game they really do pull this off. The environment is stellar, on point at most of the time, with effects for almost every natural environment that really make it feel like it's hitting the part. This whole game is PBR to the extreme, and by this I mean physical based rendering. It seems to be the basis for just about everything in the game. Whether you look at the characters, how they move their skin, their clothing, to the grass, the textures, the effects, the water, it's all made to look real. The soup that's served up by Ignis looks amazing. It's such a simple thing and yet so much attention has gone into it. All the food and all those small little details are really here, and they've made a monumental effort to make sure this world feels real. And they've done that as well by incorporating real world companies into the game too. You see silly things for like MasterCard and other things that we'll see in the average shop in the real world, and they're very much a part of this game. It's all amazing, brought with real world influences into it, so it feels like a fantasy based on reality. It's exactly what they wanted it to be, and the idea of this is pretty spectacular. It's not a joke, it's all done with all seriousness, and it's so subtle that it works really well. And of course you're exploring all this with the single focus point of Noctis. 90% of the game you're with him and you explore this world as he does too. Remember, he's still the Crown Prince and hasn't really left Insomnia much, and so everything that's being explored here is new to him too. You're seeing it with him, you're exploring this world with him, and obviously his companions as well, but it's all very beautiful as you go from one set piece to the next. The world feels real. It feels alien to an extent, with things like the crazy rock structures, the Disc of Corthus, all real world based but very much fantasy in their inception. I do feel like once you're in the second half of the game, post Tales History, it does embrace the fantasy aspect just a little bit more. The world of Niflheim by far certainly feels like it's more on the craziness when it comes to weather effects like the Shiva area or just the prison that chapter 13 takes place in. It's all very much fantasy compared to everything else, but I don't mind that because it's very much a different country as well. There's a stark contrast between every place you go in the game, whether it's Insomnia or Altissa or just Niflheim as a whole. In fact though, I believe the whole game gets a lot of slack for its open world versus linear approach. I've said this several times now, and I believe the game contracts as the story becomes more focused on one thing, and I personally don't have a problem with this, but I know the amount of people who will just consistently be angry that the open world aspect is pretty much dropped once you're done with Leviathan and Lunafreya has been killed. The linear aspect works for me. Yes, I know it was never made to be that linear, and the intentions, if they'd had the time to fully develop it, and maybe another 1 to 2 years, we would have seen so much more on top of this. I believe in time all these extra things that we know are there but haven't been used will be used in a way that makes 15 a much more wholesome experience, but I like what the game does and it doesn't really bother me. Gameplay as well is also something that I've never seen quite done in the same way. Now obviously the original version, when it was still Final Fantasy Versus 13, was very much an evolution of Kingdom Hearts' battle system, and while there are still allusions to that in the actual battle system we have in 15, it's very much its own thing, and I couldn't be more thankful from it. Obviously we've seen how it's evolved from demo to demo, and what we've got in the finished game is something that I think is spectacular about 90% of the time. The battle system couldn't be simpler. You hold a button to attack, you hold a button to dodge, you can pull up your skills, and for those of you who have trouble with action games, they've found a way to include a wait mode just like classic Final Fantasy games, and you should very much take advantage of that. You move around the battle, you can jump, you can use various skills as well, and you can gather up AP by defeating enemies in order to increase your skills and learn more things for both you and your party as a whole. On top of that as well, be very mindful of where your party is in the battle, because you can do link strikes with them when you get behind an enemy too. You can set up all sorts of things that are so beautifully done with their animation and how it blends from one to the next. The animation in this game is stellar, just because it's all very real based as well. There's so much motion capture, but it's so well blended in with hand keyed animation as well to make sure everything blends properly. The simplest things like Noctis' run cycle to his battle animations that are a bit more fantastical, but that's because they have to be, but there's still fantastic movement, and outside of Noctis' player control, the AI control companions have much more fidelity with that animation because they're limited, where unlike the player who can do anything at any time, does mean there's a lot more jumping between animations, but there's nothing more spectacular than the great link strike between two characters, or when you're setting off one of the skills and you're choosing to fly with Noctis, with each character having a variety of skills that you can assign to them as well for battle. But the whole battle system as a whole, with Noctis at least, revolves around his ability to warp around the battlefield. Warping is a vital piece of how the fighting works in Final Fantasy XV. You can warp to any enemy using a warp strike, you can warp to any location in order to take a breather, to relax, and to just let your MP stack back up. It gets you out of battle, it gets you out of harm's way when you need to be, but it also gets you right into the fray as well. That's the important part. It's not just about the fighting and the attacking. It's very much a game that, beyond all that, is trying to encourage you to take your time with the battles, to plan stuff out, to make sure you dodge and find the best time to get in there, and pick your battles accordingly, pick your attack times accordingly, wait till you're able to flank an enemy, get behind them, use the right skills, use magic from combinations of elements that you've acquired from just wandering around with items in order to make stuff that really helps benefit the situation you're in. Exploration on top of that as well is fantastic, and it all takes a variety of different modes throughout the game. Obviously walking around and driving are your main two, with the Gladio which services you throughout the open world aspect of the game, and you can walk anywhere too, along with chocobos that are introduced later, all with strangely weird control schemes that are all uniquely individual, to the point which feels like someone different coded each one of them. Chocobos control completely different to walking, and the Regalia can be a real pain to control until you work out that it's essentially autopiloting most of the time. You can let Ignis do the driving for you anyway and still hijack that if you want to, go somewhere else or just make the car crash, because why not? On top of that, once you finish the game as well, you're given the flying car if you do a special quest, and that brings one more aspect of travelling that is absolutely a pain if you want to do, and outside of the places you have to fly to get to, I really actually don't recommend flying. It's more of an allusion to the original Final Fantasy games, as well as obviously being the key to one specific dungeon in the game that I'm going to talk about later. But ultimately, all these things come together to make a fantastic battle system, and then on top of that we have the summons as well. The summons are magnificent, they are breathtaking, and they have a scale that's like no other. They come into the battlefield, they often scoop Noctis up out of the way before they rain down massive destruction, and some things are absolutely brilliant how they choose to incorporate these with one-off special summon situations that can happen, like with Bahamut and Shiva against Ifrit, and the absolutely fantastic Titan summon. If you choose to fight the Adamantoise and get to summon him, he'll leap into the battlefield, finally going toe to toe with an enemy that's equally the same scale as him, punching the living daylights out of it. It's absolutely brilliant and somewhat campy to a degree, but just entertaining as well. They make for a nice break from the battlefields, and also can be your Hail Mary when you need to, as they all have specific settings and locations necessary to summon them. Outside of battle as well, the four of you each have their own skills, whether it be Noctis with his fishing, which is his own mini game you can get throughout the game. Ignis of course does the cooking, while Gladio finds items around after battle to help with his survival skill, and Prompto takes pictures, whether it be in battle with a patch or outside, and every time you rest you're able to pick the pictures you like and save them to your hard drive or share them online. It's a nice little feature, and sometimes some of the pictures you take are absolutely brilliant. Obviously there are preset ones, there are thousands of preset ones throughout the game, but there are also random pictures too, and some of them can just be hilarious, from Prompto giving a big selfie in front of his chocobos to Ignis running away from an absolutely massive snake, because it's just something the AI has randomly captured at that time. Leveling in the game as well is also very well thought out, and actually means you have to put a lot of thought into it. You get XP after battle, but it doesn't tally until you rest, but depending on where you rest you might find your experience gets an extra multiplier added to it, and so you want to wait and leave leveling to the opportune moment. But on the flip side of that, early on in the game you don't want to be travelling at night either, and you want to try and work it out so you can make the best of the experience you've tallied, crossed with wherever you decide to sleep and rest, with no experience extra bonusing being added if you actually end up camping, as opposed to just having a caravan or a room you hire out in a hotel. But on the flip side of that as well, Ignis's skills don't increase if you're not out in the wild cooking and camping. Of course, throughout this, and something that obviously doesn't come across in this video too well, is the fantastic soundtrack that's in the game. I briefly mentioned at the start of this video Florence and the Machine's cover of Stand By Me, and I stand by as it being an absolutely fantastic selection of songs that the indie darling Florence has really managed to do for this game as a whole, because submitting 3 vocal tracks that are absolutely brilliant and capturing the mood and the feel of the game. And when played at the right time, these can easily just overwhelm the player as well, with the emotional impact that they have based on the situations and the scenarios that happen in the game. But really, there's just the general instrumental tracks as well. They're all orchestrated, and there's a good reason why they're able to do live concerts with each of the tracks of these Final Fantasy games, because they are so well composed.
was hardcore!
From the breathtaking theme that happens when you summon a Titan to the battle system, and there is a lot of reference here to Kingdom Hearts 2 style of music as well, with very instrumental piano based tracks that fill in the battle systems. It feels very much like Kingdom Hearts 2, and I have to believe that this was something that was originally made with the Versus 13 and something that continued on, with new sorts of tracks being added to complement the new scope of 15 when it was redone. But say you've done all that, you've gone through the world, you've completed the story, and you're back in for that special chapter 15. What do you do now? Well, the post game has plenty of things if you haven't already done with the hundreds of quests that are listed throughout the game anyway up until that point. That's of course if you've been going back as well to do some of the extras. There are quests everywhere in Final Fantasy XV, and even beyond that as well. Once you're done with the game and you go back, you'll find there are even more special things that are made for those who have completed the game. Special challenges as well as challenges that you probably just couldn't have really ever completed in your first playthrough for the game. The flying car and the strange engine quest you need to get it don't come up until the end of the game once you're playing again in chapter 15, but of course there's other special places as well. There's a special set of dungeons which are essentially the hardest dungeons in the games that you need a special key for, that you may find doors that allow you to get into as they're hidden in the bottom of major dungeons throughout the game, but until you get the key in the quest you're not going to be able to get in them, and they represent some of the hardest challenges in the game. But on the flip side of that, they're also some of the most mundane challenges in the game, as each one of these mega dungeons is essentially a reused hallway that loops over and over again per floor. While the challenge is extremely high, I absolutely hate them, and because of this challenge it's something I'm probably not going to bother with unless they make the rewards suitable for it in a second playthrough. General places like the ruins or Castle Mark Tower, it's quite possible you would have actually beat before you got to the end of the game, and therefore finding it possible to complete the game with 13 weapons and having your whole Amiga system set up for be able to take Arden in a full 13 on 13 weapon fight. As Arden has the same weapons of you, but he has a whole set as he was a potential King of Lucius himself. Of course, let's talk about that one big dungeon that everyone goes on about, that one thing that is absolutely nothing like the rest of Final Fantasy XV. The Pytos Ruins, the one dungeon you need the flying cars to get to, and one that is a pure platforming challenge. I've never seen anything like it in a Final Fantasy game. The Pytos Ruins throw all sorts of crazy challenges at you, and they are magnificent challenges. I spent the first 45 minutes going around just trying to work out this big open area where I was, what was happening, and still slightly fearful at the time that I could get attacked at any time. Noctis is on his own for this dungeon, his companions wait outside, and so I never knew if I was going to be ambushed. After working out it's probably just a platforming based dungeon, and this is where I should mention the controls as well. For everyone who mentions that the controls in Final Fantasy XV do not allow for precise fidelity, it's simply not the case. It takes a bit of getting used to, but you can do perfectly precise platforming in Final Fantasy XV if you're not holding the analog stick and after momentum. The controls in Final Fantasy XV are momentum based. If you're not holding the analog stick in any direction when you land, you will stay in place, and that is key to landing some of these crazy jumps. Line up your shadow from the jump, and then when you know you're there, take your hand off the analog stick and you will fall in place. And precision is the name of the game for this dungeon. And after getting into it for 45 minutes, I was greeted going through a door for it to pop up and say the Pytos Ruins. It took me 45 minutes to get into the entrance to the dungeon, and then another 4-hour slog afterwards to finally break through. And it's absolutely magnificent, but it's not just a seemingly random dungeon. Anyone who's a fan of Dark Souls will know what's going on here. There is a story being told by the actual physical topology of this place. Every room, every challenge is showing the new part of an adventure that happened in the past. The story of Ifrit and Shiva and the other Eidolons in the past. It's a fantastically well done metaphor for an entire story that's revealed to you through the other lore that's presented through the game. This is the Dark Souls storytelling at its best. It's visualization as a plot, and it doesn't even matter if you don't get any of it, because the actual platforming itself makes it a worthwhile and fulfilling challenge. But it's something that I've never seen the likes of done in a Final Fantasy game, and I really hope they try stuff like this in the future. But aside from this as well, you have your other side quests and your other general mini games to a degree too. You have Noctis' fishing, which has suitable quests along with it, as well as finding all the people across the map. You can randomly stumble across quests at any time, that being from people who are lost and need help, to random people you bump into and say they're looking for things, or just audio cues from meeting people. And of course there's the hunts as well that you can undertake from any of the restaurants during the game. If there's one problem I have with this, it's that you're only allowed to undertake one hunt at a time, which I find really annoying for keeping track. If you could queue a load of them up and just go to that required place face them, fight them, I'd be a lot happier for it. But of course there are also the mega bosses. There's a bunch of them throughout the world that you find through hunts, and that's generally how you fight most of the end game enemies that are, well, super powerful. One in particular, however, is revealed in its own quest the first time you go back into Final Fantasy XV's past. A little quest leads you to re-meet all the people you've met in the past as they all adjourn around a big mountain where there's a lot of earthquake-like tremors happening, only for you to get close to it and the mountain to appear as an adamantoise. In this game, something that is the scale of buildings. Seriously, Noctis needs his own Megazord to take this thing down. But if you want to go in for it, it's a battle that's going to take well into an hour, if not more. I think it took me about an hour and a half, and that was going around at level 100. The challenge of this isn't actually in the gameplay. In fact, it's quite a mundane and boring battle and not really that fun. And unless, of course, as I said earlier, you summon Titan and then you're in for a real treat. As well as having its own parry system as well that you can do, where Noctis gives one of his special Amiga weapons to each one of your companions and you jump off the adamantoise in for another special skill and attack. It's a very boring hunt overall and a battle that's more of attrition than anything else. There's an achievement for it, as there would be, but ultimately this is the most powerful enemy in the game, and it doesn't feel like it's the most exciting battle of the game, unlike some of the other hunts and things that they've introduced since then. Final Fantasy XV is more than the sum of its parts. It is an achievement in so many ways that makes it interesting, and I still think after going through this, the hour and God knows how long I've been talking at this point about it, is something to marvel at, because there's so much here that I feel like I haven't mentioned. I could mention every single side quest character one after the other. I can mention all the special weapons as well that are part of a side quest, the mega dungeons, the tricks in Castle Mount Tower, the simple stuff you see just as you're going round the map, the chocobo racing, the extra forts you fight into, the fact that even combat gets mixed up with turret sections as well throughout the game, and it's something that you have the ability to do whenever you see one. It's not contextual to any reason. It gives you even more power and precision and strategy in how you choose to handle your fights. There's just so much to Final Fantasy XV that it would take hours of talking to cover every single bit, but I've talked about the stuff that interests me, the interesting things, and I think Final Fantasy XV has to be lauded, whether you think the end game is something that's just ultimately unfinished or absolutely ingenious from what they've tried to do and it's just unfortunately something that ran out of time. You have to admit that what they've done in the time that was allowed is pretty spectacular and something that really feels like the evolution of Final Fantasy as a series. I want more of this. I want more Final Fantasy XV in some form. I want a sequel. I'm actually asking for one, unlike any other Final Fantasy game. I never asked for Final Fantasy XIII 2, but I'm glad I got it, and I really hope that I get a Final Fantasy XV 2 in some form. Explore some of these characters more. Give me more of them. Give me a world or an alternative world in a different time or something that takes what we know and changes it but makes for an interesting plot. Something that perhaps leaves us with less of a sour taste in our mouth from the ending that's ultimately a tragedy. Let's have some sort of redemption for the characters in some way, or see what their sacrifices actually gained us, because at the very least the one thing I would have added to the ending was some way that time, perhaps from that first time Noctis went into the crystal, got everything fixed then, and that whole ending and apocalypse and ultimate night with all the demons overrunning everyone was somehow aborted. The amount of mass murder that happened to the world in those 10 years that gets glossed over, which I would have liked to have seen reversed in somehow, to at least make the ending a little more poignant and feel like that sacrifice meant something. At the end of it, Noctis' sacrifice saves the world, but you don't even know how much of the world is really left to have been saved. Final Fantasy XV is a flawed experience. I'm not doubting that, and I'm not going to argue against it, but it is a fun one. It is one I have wholly enjoyed and will go back to again and again. DLC is coming. It feels like it's coming by the month at this week. At the time of this final recording, when I'm finishing this, patch 1.09 is a few days from being released, and overall it's just nice to see that they're constantly updating this game to make it better, with small updates to make graphical glitches and problems like that sorted, to big full-on changes like an additional segment to chapter 13 to explore more of the other characters, like Ravus, who I said didn't get enough development, certainly gets a bit more now, and you get to see the end of the Niflheim Empire too, something that was only alluded to in the original base standard version of the game. Final Fantasy XV is a marvel of a game. I enjoy it, I love it, I'm going to play it again, and I certainly think that you owe it to yourself to try it. It's a fantasy based on reality, but more important than that, it's a Final Fantasy for fans and first timers, and that's another one of their things that they said they were doing when they developed this game, and it is true. Anyone can go and pick up and play this game. There's enough ways to play it that almost anyone will find something they like in a way they can play the game. It's enjoyable. that's what you want your games to be, and it might not be genre redefining, but I feel in a fair few ways it's groundbreaking, and you can't be happier than that with the end result. So yeah, that's Final Fantasy XV, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this. I know it was a long time coming, and it makes for the first video for this new channel. Obviously, if you're not up to date, this channel is new because my old one got taken down, and this is now how I'm going to be doing videos. No more short reviews, no more imports, just this, as well as trying to get a little support. I really would love if you could share, if you could subscribe, if you could comment, and to that end as well, for every one of these videos I'm doing a giveaway to, for those of you who hang all the way on to the end. This is my Etsy page where I do Final Fantasy based and other geek based artwork, and I will be doing giveaways through one of these prints for every videos, and I will be announcing the winner on the next case study that comes along. I really hope you enjoy this and you will share, and you can always look at my other artwork and see what you think too. I think it's something slightly different than just doing a standard giveaway, and I'll sign the thing if you want. I'll post anywhere, and thank you for watching and supporting me. If you followed me over from the old channel, thank you very much for continuing to support me, and I look forward to doing more case studies and critical analysis in the future. That's what I'm focusing on now, so I will take the time to do all this, make these videos as the best I can in a full 1080 60 FPS. I will be using every resource I have at my disposal to make these videos as good as possible for you all, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.